The chill in the air wasn't just the Melbourne night. It was the icy grip of dread that had settled over street Kilda, a dread as thick and suffocating as the fog that sometimes rolled in from the bay. They called it a whisper at first, a rumor passed between champagne flutes and cigar smoke in the city's most exclusive clubs. Then it became a shout, echoing in the sensational headlines of the morning papers. 3 men, all wealthy, all powerful, all dead. And each, without fail, bore the same gruesome signature, a single, scarlet silk ribbon, neatly tied around the wrist. I remember that night, the night the third body was found, with a clarity that still pricks at the edges of my composure. I was at the Prince Consort, a rather respectable establishment for a lady of my proclivities, but even there, the air was heavy with unspoken fear. Heads were bent close, hushed tones exchanging theories about the Scarlet Widow. A phantom, they said, a creature of beauty and venom, who lured men to their doom with a smile and a deadly embrace. Nonsense, I thought, sipping my French 75. A woman of such efficiency, of such artistic flair? She'd be more myth than reality. Then, the telegram arrived. A crisp, cream envelope, delivered by a breathless young man whose eyes darted around the opulent room as if expecting to see the widow herself lurking in the shadows. My name, emblazoned in bold, formal script. My heart, which usually beat with the steady rhythm of adventure, gave a sudden, painful lurch. It was from Detective Inspector Jack Robinson. Unusual. We usually met under far less formal, and often far more amusing, circumstances. I tore it open. The words, stark and chilling, seemed to jump off the page, each letter a tiny dagger twisting in my gut. Miss Fisher. Urgent. Arthur Harrington. His townhouse. Found an hour ago. Same ribbon. And, a note addressed to you. Arthur. Arthur Harrington. The name hit me like a physical blow, scattering the cool composure I so carefully maintained. Not just any man. Arthur. My Arthur. Or rather, the Arthur who had been mine, briefly, intensely years ago amidst the chaos and glamour of wartime Paris. A charming war hero, with eyes that held the ghosts of battles fought and a smile that could melt glaciers. We'd parted ways on amicable terms, a bittersweet farewell dictated by geography and my own nomadic spirit, but the embers of our connection had never truly died. They merely smoldered, ready to ignite with a single glance or a familiar laugh. Now, those embers felt like ashes, cold and dead. The French 75 suddenly tasted like bitter medicine. I pushed my chair back, the scrape echoing too loudly in the suddenly silent room. Every eye was on me. They knew, somehow, that the telegram held ill tidings. The air crackled with morbid curiosity, a ravenous hunger for tragedy that only high society can truly master. I ignored them, my mind already racing, the analytical engine behind my sharp wit kicking into frantic gear. Arthur. Dead. A red ribbon. And a note. Addressed to me. The thought sent a shiver down my spine that had nothing to do with the night's chill. Was it a message from the killer? A taunt? Or something far more personal, far more devastating? My driver, the ever-reliable and utterly unflappable, was waiting by the Hispano-Suiza. She took one look at my face and knew. "Everything all right, miss?" she asked, her voice softer than usual. "No, I replied, my voice tight. "Nothing is all right. To St. Kilda." And quickly. The drive felt interminable. The grand Victorian houses of St. Kilda, usually so stately and imposing, now seemed to loom like silent sentinels, guarding dark secrets. Each gas lamp cast long, dancing shadows that twisted and writhed, transforming familiar streets into something sinister, otherworldly. My thoughts were a whirlwind of images. Arthur's infectious laugh, the way his hand felt in mine, the promises whispered under a moonlit Parisian sky. And then, superimposed over those cherished memories, the horrifying image of a scarlet ribbon, a splash of violent color against a dead man's skin. We pulled up to Arthur's elegant townhouse. The street was already swarming with flashing blue lights, somber police officers, and a gawking crowd, kept at bay by a thin rope. The house, usually a beacon of vibrant life and lavish parties, now stood dark and silent, a tomb. The air thrummed with a morbid energy, a strange mix of official solemnity and the thrilling pulse of a macabre circus. I pushed my way through the throng, my evening dress, a shimmering emerald green silk, feeling incongruous in the grim tableau. Heads turned. Whispers followed. "It's Phryne Fisher," I heard. "The detective. What's she doing here?" Little did they know, this wasn't just a case. It was personal. Inspector Robinson met me at the door. His face was grim, etched with a fatigue that spoke of sleepless nights and horrific discoveries. His usual stern demeanor was softened, just slightly, by a flicker of genuine concern in his eyes. He knew about Arthur and me. Everyone in our circle did, to some extent. "Phryne," he said, his voice low. "I'm so sorry." I nodded, my throat suddenly dry. "The note, Jack. You said there was a note." He led me inside, past a flurry of forensic activity. The air was thick with the metallic tang of blood and the acrid scent of disinfectant. Every creak of the floorboards, every hushed command from a police officer, seemed amplified, grating on my raw nerves. This wasn't the sparkling ballroom of a society gala. It was a crime scene, a place where life had violently ceased. Arthur's library. That's where they found him. The scene was disturbingly neat, almost staged. He lay on the Persian rug, a rich tapestry of crimson and gold, which now seemed to mock his fate. His dinner jacket was still perfectly pressed, his bow tie immaculate. Only the stillness of his form, the unnatural angle of his head, betrayed the truth. And there it was, stark and horrifying against the pristine white of his shirt cuff, the crimson splash of a silken ribbon, tied with a precise, chilling knot. A knot that screamed of deliberate intent, of cold, calculating murder. I felt a wave of nausea, a dizzying lurch in my stomach that threatened to overwhelm me. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, forcing myself to breathe, to push down the grief, the shock, the burgeoning fury. Phryne Fisher did not crumble. Not now. Not ever. "The note," I repeated, my voice barely a whisper. Robinson gestured to a small, elegantly folded piece of parchment lying on the antique mahogany desk. It was tucked neatly under a silver letter opener, as if left there with care. My name was scrawled on the front, in elegant, looping script. Not Arthur's handwriting. No. This was feminine, precise. My heart hammered against my ribs. I picked it up, my fingers trembling slightly. The paper felt strangely cool against my skin. I unfolded it, dread coiling in my stomach like a venomous snake. The message was brief. Just 2 lines. And it plunged me into a fresh, terrifying abyss of confusion and despair. "He knew too much. You're next." My breath hitched. My name was signed, not by the Scarlet Widow as I had half expected, but by a single cryptic letter. Not a vengeful lover, they said. Not a simple fortune hunter. This was something far darker, far more intricate. Arthur, my charming war hero, knew something. Something dangerous enough to get him killed. And now whoever it was, believed I knew it too. Or perhaps, they simply wanted to silence me before I could begin to uncover the truth. The room, the police, the dead man on the rug, they all receded. All that remained was the chilling prophecy of those 2 lines, the scent of fear, and the image of a scarlet ribbon. My old flame was gone, extinguished by a ruthless hand, and I, Phryne Fisher, found myself standing at the precipice of a mystery that threatened not just my reputation, but my very life. The game, it seemed, had already begun, and I was not merely an observer, but a target. This was no ordinary case. This was personal. And I would not rest until I had found Arthur's killer, No matter the danger, no matter the cost. My glamour, my wit, my fearlessness, they would all be put to the ultimate test. The Scarlet Widow of St. Kilda. She had my attention. And she had, irrevocably, my fury. The night was just beginning. Chapter 1. A Knot of Guilt. The mahogany desk, usually a symbol of Arthur's steady, ordered life, was now a pedestal for the macabre. The chilling message, signed only with an E, was tucked securely into my beaded clutch. Jack's men, the grim, unsmiling constables who usually looked upon my presence with a mixture of awe and resentment, were efficiently documenting the scene, their flashlights carving clinical arcs through the library's opulent shadows. But their efficiency was impersonal. Mine was fueled by a cold, searing rage. I knelt beside Arthur, my emerald silk dress pooling elegantly on the Persian rug. The silence in my corner of the room was thick, a respectful boundary established by Jack's unspoken order. I ignored the faint, metallic smell and focused on the signature detail of the killer, the scarlet ribbon. "Show me the knot, Jack," I said, my voice quiet, flat. I didn't need to look at his face to know the grim expression it wore. He hesitated, then motioned for Sergeant Hugh Collins, the young man whose devotion to the inspector bordered on the religious, to hold his lamp closer. The ribbon, a rich, woven silk, screamed of expensive taste, perhaps French. The color was a deep, uncompromising crimson, the shade of old Bordeaux wine. But it was the knot that held my attention, a knot tied around Arthur's unyielding wrist. It wasn't a bow. It wasn't a slip knot. It was a precise, almost ceremonial Turk's head knot, a complex weave of interlocking loops often used in decorative nautical work. "Remarkable," I murmured, leaning closer. "A domestic killer would use a simple square knot. A clumsy one, a granny knot. This is deliberate, skilled. It speaks of a steady hand and a purpose that transcends mere impulse." I touched the silk, its coolness a stark contrast to the memory of Arthur's warm skin. It also speaks of a killer with access to specific, specialized knowledge. Someone who has sailed, perhaps. Or someone who deals in expensive textile arts. That silk is not from a haberdashery. It's a bespoke weave. Jack sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. A silk ribbon, a Turk's head knot, and a note threatening the most tenacious detective in the Southern Hemisphere. It's certainly a change from the usual drunken knife fight. He looked at me, his eyes guarded. "The note, Phryne. Why you?" I straightened, the anger giving way to a calculated resolve. I handed him a photographic copy of the note. I always carried a compact camera for moments such as this, keeping the original close. Because Arthur knew something. Something dangerous enough to get him killed, and something I am apparently supposed to know, or am expected to uncover. The E is not a signature of affection. It's a designation. A threat. Or perhaps, an organization. Organization. He scoffed, gesturing around the library. A mysterious female assassin is the current going concern, Phryne. The press has dubbed her the Scarlet Widow. The victims were all prominent, wealthy men. They all had certain histories. History, Jack, is often a matter of perspective, I countered, sweeping my gaze around the room one last time. But let's discuss the obvious. Who gains from Arthur's demise? Who benefits from his silence? Robinson hesitated, and that slight pause was all the confirmation I needed. His eyes flickered away from mine, a classic tell. Phryne, before your arrival, we had already identified a person of interest. Arthur. He was recently involved with a woman. I raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. Arthur was always involved with a woman, Jack. It was part of his considerable charm. Be specific. This one was different. Intense. He was considering a proposal. Her name is Clarice Beaumont. She's the widow of a man who died tragically during the war, a man Arthur served with." He paused, then dropped the bombshell, the words heavy with implication. "And her husband's estate was rather diminished after the war. She stands to gain considerably from Arthur's will." My jaw tightened. A classic red herring, the vengeful lover, the financially motivated widow. It was too neat, too conventional for the elegance of that knot. Yet, it was the official line, the easy answer the police would pursue. "Ah, the simple, classic tale of greed and passion," I purred, though my heart ached with the absurdity of it. "And where might this passionately motivated, financially strained widow be located, Jack? I should hate for the poor girl to slip away while you're distracted by the intricacies of French silk." Jack looked relieved that I hadn't erupted in protest. "She's known to frequent a rather exclusive establishment in the city. A cabaret. The Velvet Lantern." The name hit a chord, a low, throbbing beat in the city's dangerous heart. The Velvet Lantern. Notorious. Opulent. It was less a cabaret and more a theater of hidden desires, where the wealthy came to shed their respectability, where politicians mingled with racketeers, and where forbidden affairs were the main spectacle. It was a nexus of Melbourne's glittering, corrupt underworld, a perfect stage for blackmail and, perhaps, murder. If Arthur was involved, it wasn't just a dalliance. It was something far more political, far more dangerous. "The Velvet Lantern," I repeated, a slow, dangerous smile curling my lips. How wonderfully theatrical. "Well, Jack, you search for your gold-digging widow. I shall look for the complex knot and the conspiracy that binds her." I left the grim, blood-soaked elegance of the library and stepped back into the night. Was waiting, the Hispano-Suiza, a sleek, black predator purring at the curb. "Dot," I said, slipping into the opulent leather seat, the chill of the crime scene already beginning to fade under the heat of my resolve. "I need a new dress. Something to turn heads, but easy to move in. And then, we pay a visit to the Velvet Lantern." My mind was already racing, piecing together the scant evidence. Arthur's war history, a sophisticated silk knot, the threat, and the high society hub of corruption. This was about more than a woman scorned. This was about secrets Arthur had carried from the trenches of France to the drawing rooms of Melbourne. Within 2 hours, I had shed the emerald frock for something more appropriate for the underworld. A striking gold lame gown, shimmering with every movement, complemented by a long, sable stole. It was daring, demanding attention, and utterly necessary for the stage I was about to enter. I clipped a small, pearl-handled derringer inside the thigh-high slit of the dress, a necessary precaution when dancing with the devil. The Velvet Lantern was tucked away on a discreet side street, guarded by 2 massive bouncers who looked like they were carved from granite. Inside, the atmosphere was intoxicating, a heady mixture of cigarette smoke, cheap perfume, expensive liquor, and the pulse of a truly excellent jazz band. The air was thick with the scent of opportunity and sin. The room was vast, dominated by a circular velvet-draped stage where a chanteuse, draped in black feathers and melancholy, was weaving a smoky tale of lost love. Everywhere I looked, I saw the faces that ran Melbourne. Smug politicians, weary captains of industry, and men whose tailored suits couldn't quite hide the danger in their eyes. I took a seat at a secluded, red velvet booth, ordering a champagne cocktail with a flourish. My eyes, trained by years of observation, began to skim the crowd, looking for anything that screamed Clarice Beaumont, the grieving widow, the sudden suspect. It took me less than 5 minutes. She was not grieving. She was radiant. Clarice Beaumont was sitting at a private balcony table overlooking the main floor, the epitome of 1920s glamour. She had short, dark hair, eyes that sparkled with reckless mirth, and a smile that promised, and possibly delivered, danger. She wore a dress of shimmering black sequins, a perfect visual counterpoint to the Scarlet Widow narrative. She was laughing, her hand resting casually on the arm of the man beside her. I felt a sudden, sharp intake of breath, a physical jolt that made the ice in my cocktail glass clatter. It wasn't just that she was beautiful and seemingly untroubled by the death of her supposed fiancé. It was the man beside her. He was the spitting image of Arthur Harrington. The same strong jawline, the same set of the shoulders, the slightly haunted look in the eyes that spoke of the war. They could have been brothers. No. Closer. Twins. But Arthur had been an only child. I knew that for a fact. My analytical engine, which had been humming with theories of war profiteers and political scandals, suddenly seized up. This wasn't a matter of resemblance. It was unnerving. Was this a new lover, a replacement? Or a bizarre, desperate attempt to hold on to the past? I reached for my cocktail, forcing my hand to remain steady. I needed to observe, to understand this shocking, impossible duplicate. I was so focused on the man, the sheer audacity of his presence, that I almost missed the moment he looked up. His eyes, identical in shape and intensity to Arthur's, scanned the room, sweeping over the dancers, the tables, the shadows. And then they landed on me. For a heartbeat, the music faded, the laughter died, and the smoky air seemed to solidify. His eyes widened, not in recognition of me, Phryne Fisher, but in sheer, unadulterated terror. It was a look of a man who had seen a ghost, or perhaps, a hunter. He immediately snatched his hand from Clarissa's, his knuckles white against the velvet tablecloth, and began to whisper frantically into her ear. His gaze locked on me. He wasn't afraid of being caught in a compromising position. He was afraid of being seen. Clarisse, ever the composed creature, turned her head slowly, her eyes finding mine. Her sparkling smile vanished, replaced by an expression of cold, sharp calculation. And then, the man made his move. He bolted. He scrambled from the balcony, pushing past patrons, his movement panicked and clumsy, anything but the controlled grace of a war hero. He fled toward a discreet, unmarked door in the back of the room, leaving Clarisse alone on the balcony, watching me. My heart hammered a desperate rhythm against my ribs. This was no new lover. This was no replacement. This man, an absolute duplicate of Arthur Harrington, was running from the sight of me at a speed that suggested a world of lies was rapidly unraveling. I slammed my cocktail down, heedless of the splash. I didn't stop to apologize, didn't wait for Dot. I plunged into the crowd, the gold lame a flashing beacon against the dark velvet. I had to catch him. I had to know. Who was he, and why did he look exactly like my dead flame? I reached the unmarked door, throwing it open to find a service hallway leading to the back alley, the dark, dangerous artery of the city. A figure in a dinner jacket was already vanishing into the night fog. I ran, my expensive heels clattering urgently on the damp cobblestones. My lungs burned, but the chase was irresistible. "Stop!" I shouted, the word swallowed by the thick night air. I rounded the corner of the alley, skidding on a discarded crate. The man was gone. Vanished into the maze of speakeasies and hidden entrances. But he had dropped something. A small, heavy object lying innocently on the wet stone. I snatched it up, my fingers closing around the cold metal. It was a dog tag. A military-issue identification tag, tarnished with age and use. I held it up to the dim glow of the lone alley lamp. Engraved on the metal were the familiar lines. A service number, a name. Harrington. Thomas. Not Arthur. Thomas. And then I noticed the second smaller object that had fallen from his pocket. A fragment of thick, crimson silk. It wasn't a ribbon, just a piece of scrap, but the color, the weave, it was identical to the silk tied around Arthur's dead wrist. My knees suddenly felt weak. Arthur had no twin. Arthur had no brother named Thomas. Yet, here was a mirror image, running for his life, dropping proof of a shared surname and a fabric that screamed of murder. I stood alone in the dark alley, the scent of fear and diesel thick in the air, the cold metal of the dog tag and the smooth silk of the scrap pressing into my palm. My old flame was dead, but a ghost with his face was alive and running. And he was involved in the Scarlet Widow's bloody work. The truth was infinitely more complex and terrifying than a simple murder for money. I was not just facing a conspiracy. I was facing a betrayal that ran deeper than blood. The stakes had just tripled. I needed to find Thomas Harrington. And I needed to know what secret Arthur had been killed to protect. I slipped the dog tag and the silk into my clutch, the chill of the night unable to touch the burning resolve in my heart. The velvet lantern was not the end of the line. It was the entry point to a rabbit hole lined with silk and blood. The game was afoot, and the city's shadows suddenly felt very, very close. Chapter 2. The Double Life. The alley behind the velvet lantern smelled of stale beer and desperation. I stood there for a long moment, the cold dog tag, Harrington, Thomas, burning a hole through the fine leather of my clutch. My sophisticated gold lame dress, meant for the opulence of the cabaret, felt suddenly exposed and vulnerable in the gritty dark. The dog tag confirmed the impossibility. Arthur had a twin, or at least a man who shared his face, name, and military past, a man who was alive and directly connected to the crimson ribbon of the Scarlet Widow. I reached the Hispano-Suiza, where Dot was waiting, reading a dime novel with an air of profound uninterest, utterly oblivious to the drama that had unfolded 20 feet away. "Dot," I said, slipping into the back seat. "We need to conduct an immediate, highly discreet reconnaissance. I want to know everything about the Harrington family. Specifically, any mention of a Thomas Harrington. Dig through the war records, the society gossip columns from a decade ago, anything." Sensing the shift from routine case to personal emergency, snapped the book shut. Right away, Mississippi. The ride back to my glorious domain in Melbourne felt like an interrogation room on wheels. I sat in the dark, the silk fragment and the dog tag spread on my lap, analyzing the data points. Why was Thomas alive, moving in Arthur's circles, yet running in terror from the sight of me? Why the twin-like resemblance? My network, a glorious web of connections spanning from dock workers to dames of the highest society, worked with ruthless efficiency. By dawn, as I was sipping my first cup of perfectly brewed Turkish coffee, the reports started to filter in. The information was shocking, but chillingly simple. Arthur Harrington, VC, Victoria Cross, the highest military honor. War hero. Wounded, but survived. Known to have a single, younger sister who died in childhood. No brother. The family was small, prominent, and impeccably documented. Then came the second layer of reports, dug from dusty military archives and the fragile memory of an old family solicitor. There was a Thomas Harrington, distantly related, a cousin, a childhood friend, but the reports were consistent. Thomas Harrington had died in 1917 in a skirmish in the Belgian trenches. A confirmed casualty, listed as missing in action, presumed dead. The file was closed, the grief accepted, the hero mourned. I sat back in my velvet chaise lounge, the coffee growing cold. Arthur, my handsome, charming Arthur, was either harboring a dead man, or he was hiding the most spectacular case of identity theft and betrayal I had ever encountered. The man at the cabaret, Thomas, was wearing Arthur's face, a face the entire city believed belonged only to the victim. He knew too much. "You're next." The note suddenly took on a profound new meaning. Did Arthur know too much about Thomas? Or was he killed because he was using Thomas's identity to cover a secret related to his wartime service? The Scarlet Widow, it seemed, was targeting the rot that had festered since the armistice. The trail led back to the Velvet Lantern, and specifically, to Clarice Beaumont. She had been sitting there, calm and gorgeous, watching Thomas bolt like a frightened rabbit. She held the key to this duplicity. I dressed in a sharp, dove-grey suit, powerfully tailored, commanding respect, for the morning. I instructed Dot to drive me back to the cabaret, this time through the front entrance, demanding to see Miss Beaumont. The Velvet Lantern was a different creature in the day. The opulence was still there, but without the seductive glow of the evening lamps. It looked a bit worn, a bit tawdry. The air conditioning was off, and the stale smell of yesterday's smoke and spilled liquor was heavy. I marched past a disgruntled manager who attempted to bar my way. "Tell Miss Beaumont that Miss Fisher is here regarding her fiancé's unfortunate demise," I announced, my voice brooking no argument. My reputation often preceded me, and fear, I find, is an excellent lubricant for bureaucracy. I was shown to a small, cluttered office backstage, a chaotic contrast to the cabaret's front-of-house glamour. Clarice Beaumont, surprisingly, was waiting. She was wearing a simple silk dressing gown and looked far less radiant, her eyes holding the exhaustion of a woman who was living on the sharp edge of a blade. She didn't offer me a seat. "I assume Inspector Robinson sent you to pry into my grief, Miss Fisher. You're wasting your time. Arthur's death is a tragedy, but I had nothing to do with it." "Inspector Robinson is currently chasing the red herring of financial gain, Miss Beaumont," I countered, leaning against the doorframe, projecting an image of casual dominance. "I, however, am interested in the truth. And the truth, I believe, involves two men with one face." The casual facade she maintained shattered. Her eyes flickered with a sudden, devastating fear. She gripped the edge of her mahogany desk so tightly her knuckles went white. "I don't know what you're talking about," she whispered, her voice tight with panic. I advanced, stopping directly across the desk from her. I opened my clutch, pulled out the cold dog tag and the crimson silk fragment, and placed them side by side on the desk. "Harrington, Thomas," I read aloud, my voice deliberately slow and measured. "Arthur's dead cousin, Thomas Harrington, who died in 1917. Except that Thomas Harrington was very much alive last night, sitting at your table, before he ran like a thief when he saw me. And he left this small memento." I tapped the fragment of silk. "Identical to the ribbon tied around your fiancé's wrist." Clarice looked down at the evidence. The denial was gone, replaced by a desperate resignation. She took a deep, shuddering breath and looked up, her eyes blazing with a strange mix of anguish and fury. "Thomas didn't kill Arthur," she hissed, her voice low and venomous. "Arthur was killed because of the same damned reason Thomas is hiding. Because of what they did in France." "Elaborate," I commanded, crossing my arms, my detective's resolve hardening my heart against the sudden appearance of her distress. "Arthur and Thomas were not cousins," she confessed, the words tumbling out in a rush of despair. "They were foster brothers, raised together. They enlisted together. They were indistinguishable. But in 1917, during the skirmish, Thomas took a bullet that should have killed him, and Arthur saved his life by dragging him to a field hospital. But by the time Arthur went back, the records were already filed. Thomas Harrington, MIA, presumed dead. Arthur was wounded, listed as a survivor." She paused, staring at the silk fragment. They realized they had a unique opportunity. They were both officers. Thomas, the dead man, could move in the shadows. Arthur, the hero, could move in the light. They used this to their advantage. They had a singular cause, Miss Fisher. They were hunting. Hunting what? War profiteers. Clarice spat out the words like poison. Men here in Melbourne who made fortunes selling faulty equipment. Shoddy rifles, spoiled rations, things that cost the lives of the men they commanded. Arthur was trying to expose them. He was gathering evidence, using his hero status as a cover. Thomas was the ghost, moving where Arthur couldn't. The Velvet Lantern? It's where the most powerful of these profiteers, the filthiest of them, come to play. Arthur was blackmailing them for information, for funds to help the soldiers they ruined. The sheer audacity of the scheme was breathtaking. The war hero, a blackmailer. The Scarlet Widow, not a singular killer, but a symbol used to terrify the guilty. And the silk ribbon? I asked, my mind racing through the moral implications. That wasn't their signature, Clarice whispered, her voice raw. That's her signature. The real widow. We only heard the whispers. We think she might be targeting the same men. But Arthur was killed because he discovered who she was, and who she was working for. He found a ledger, a record of the profiteers' transactions, and he tried to make a deal with her to expose them. But she didn't want a deal. She wanted silence. I felt a dizzying mix of horror and exhilaration. My war hero Arthur was a moral vigilante, using his false identity for a righteous purpose. And now he was dead because he got too close to a killer who was also fighting for justice, but with a far more permanent solution. Where is Thomas now, Clarice? Hiding. They know he's alive. They'll kill him to keep the ledger a secret. He was supposed to meet me here this morning. He wanted me to get a message to someone. But he didn't show. I had my answer. Arthur's too much knowledge was the identity of the Scarlet Widow, and the ledger of the war profiteers. The E was a signature, perhaps, of the widow herself, or the organization she represented. I stood, my gaze sweeping the small, messy office. I believe you, Miss Beaumont. Now, I suggest you leave Melbourne. You're no longer safe. As I reached the door, ready to pursue the real killer and the political conspiracy that fueled her, my heel scuffed against something lodged beneath the filing cabinet. It was a loose floorboard. I knelt quickly, my gloved hands prying it up. Underneath, nestled on a bed of dust, was a neatly rolled parchment. I pulled it out. It was a list. A list of names written in tight, precise script. Names of prominent politicians, generals, and industrialists. The war profiteers. But at the bottom, written in a different hand, a bold, elegant hand, was one line. A chilling summation. The ledger is with T. Kill the woman. And next to that, drawn in red ink, was a small, crudely rendered drawing of a Turk's head knot. My breath caught. The list was a kill list. And the woman was Clarice. The drawing of the knot, the killer's true signature, proved that Thomas was not only involved, but that he was about to be the next victim, framed for Clarice's death. But the final line, scrawled beneath the knot, was the most disturbing. I know you're watching, Fisher. Meet me at the Red Lady's lair at midnight. Come alone. Hey. I looked up, adrenaline flooding my veins. The Scarlet Widow, the killer, knew who I was, knew I was investigating, and was now issuing a direct challenge. She hadn't just murdered Arthur, she was playing a dangerous game of cat and mouse, and I was the mouse she intended to corner. I checked my derringer. The velvet lantern felt suddenly suffocating. I had to find Thomas before the killer did, and I had to accept the challenge. The Red Lady's lair. The name was theatrical, ominous, and utterly irresistible. The game was no longer just a mystery. It was a deadly date. Chapter 3. The Red Lady's Lair. The thrill of the chase was a potent antidote to grief. I left a pale, trembling Clarice with the promise of discreet protection, a network of loyal friends and the threat of my own considerable displeasure should anyone touch her, and drove straight for my contact network. The name Red Lady's Lair was certainly evocative, but in Melbourne's underground, such names usually referred to something brutally practical: a gambling den, a hidden opium parlor, or a discreet, high-end brothel. My sources, a carefully cultivated collection of informants ranging from jazz musicians to petty thieves, were quick to enlighten me. The Red Lady's Lair was a private, clandestine club, famed for its extravagant, dangerous clientele and its host, Madame Roxana, a figure as alluring as she was intimidating. It was tucked deep within the hidden alleyways of Little Lawn, shielded by a seemingly impenetrable fortress of dilapidated warehouses. The hour was late, creeping towards midnight. The city was shrouded in a heavy mist, the kind that dampens sound and heightens suspicion. I didn't take dot. This was an assignment for Miss Fisher alone. I traded my tailored suit for a stunning scarlet bias-cut evening gown, the fabric shimmering like spilled wine, and draped myself in a luxurious coat of black fox fur. If I was walking into the Red Lady's lair, I was going to do it with flair. I rechecked the small pearl-handled derringer tucked into the matching scarlet holster on my thigh, a discreet measure of assurance. As I navigated the labyrinthine back streets, the grim reality of the city pressed in. This was where the glamour faded, where money talked louder than law, and where the promises of the 1920s dissolved into the desperate struggle of the underworld. The lair was hidden behind a false wall in a seemingly abandoned textile factory. A knock pattern and a whispered password, Crimson Tide, gained me entry. Inside, the contrast was shocking. The space was immense, a cathedral of vice. Gilded cages held exotic birds, crystal chandeliers cast shimmering light over tables piled high with chips, and the air thrummed with the frantic energy of illegal gambling. At the heart of it all was a stage bathed in blood-red light, currently empty. And there was Madame Roxana. She was seated on a raised dais, a queen surveying her domain, dressed in black velvet and heavy gold jewelry, her hair a startling, unnatural shade of ruby red. Her eyes, sharp and assessing, met mine the moment I stepped into the light. She smiled, a slow, professional expression devoid of warmth. Miss Fisher. What a delight. We rarely see such exquisite taste in this part of town, especially on a police night. I'm not the police, madam, I replied, moving toward her dais with a confident stride. I'm a private inquiry agent, here by invitation. I believe I have a date with the Scarlet Widow. Roxana laughed, a low, throaty sound that drew attention. The widow. You expect to find a vengeful phantom at my humble establishment? Surely the police chief has his men searching the cemeteries. I expect to find an organization, I corrected, maintaining eye contact. A killer who uses a Turk's head knot and the initials A. A killer who is currently framing a man named Thomas Harrington for the murder of his foster brother. And a killer who wants to speak to me about a certain ledger detailing war profiteering. Roxana's smile finally faltered. Her eyes narrowed, and a sudden sharp chill permeated the air. She motioned to a massive silent man who stood guard behind her. He nodded curtly, and several other figures melted out of the shadows, effectively sealing the room. You are very bold, Miss Fisher, Roxana said, her voice dropping to a dangerous purr. Perhaps foolish. Has been waiting for you in the private salon. She pointed toward an ornate, curtained archway leading off the main floor. But understand this. In my lair, I am the only one who collects the debts. And my patience is finite. I nodded, the unspoken threat clear. I was under her protection only until my meeting was concluded, and any trouble I caused would be paid for, dearly. I walked through the archway into the private salon. It was a smaller, decadent room, thick with the scent of jasmine and expensive tobacco. A low fire crackled in a marble hearth. The killer was waiting. She was sitting in an armchair, silhouetted against the firelight, and she was every bit as elegant and intimidating as I had imagined. She was wearing a perfectly tailored black tuxedo, complete with a white silk cravat, her hair severely cropped. And on the table beside her, glinting innocently in the firelight, was a spool of thick scarlet silk. I paused just inside the room, allowing my composure to settle the sudden adrenaline surge. This was the moment of truth. Miss Fisher, the woman said, rising with a grace that was chilling. Her voice was cultivated, measured, and held an unmistakable edge of authority. I knew you would come. Curiosity, or perhaps a misplaced sense of loyalty to the dead. Justice, I believe, is the appropriate term, I countered, moving to a chair opposite hers, ignoring her attempt to rattle me. You are a ... The designation is adequate, she agreed, gesturing toward the spool of silk. That, Miss Fisher, is the only piece of evidence that ties me to the crimes. A bespoke weave, French, made only for a very select group of importers. I use it as a signature, a warning to men who believe themselves untouchable. The Scarlet Widow, I confirmed. A marvelous piece of misdirection. Everyone expects a desperate lover, a jealous wife. Not a woman in a perfectly cut tuxedo, conducting a campaign against war profiteers. She smiled, a genuine, tired smile this time. Arthur Harrington was a fool. A righteous, wonderful fool. He contacted me 3 weeks ago. He had compiled a remarkable amount of proof regarding the shoddy gear, the lives wasted, all tied back to 3 prominent Melbourne men, the ones who met the silk ribbon. "And you killed him," I stated, my heart tightening with a fresh wave of fury. "I didn't kill him," she said, her voice turning sharp. "I warned him. We met to discuss the ledger, the final piece of evidence detailing the transactions. Arthur was going to publish it, use the information for blackmail, force them to pay reparations to the surviving soldiers. A moral objective, achieved through immoral means," I observed. "Survival, Miss Fisher. We have no army, no government to protect us. Only swift, undeniable justice." She leaned forward. "Arthur was a threat to my operation, not because of the ledger, but because he was reckless. He was killed by his own greed, or rather, the greed of the man he was protecting, Thomas Harrington." My mind raced. This was a direct contradiction to Clarice's emotional confession. "Thomas is innocent," I argued. "He was hiding because he's afraid of the profiteers, not because he killed his foster brother." I scoffed, pulling a small worn photograph from her inner jacket pocket. She slid it across the table. It showed 2 men in military uniform, virtually identical, but one, Thomas, had a small unique scar above his left eye, a detail the lighting at the cabaret had obscured. Arthur was the blackmailer, I conceded. But Thomas was the enforcer. He was far less concerned with justice and far more interested in the wealth they were accumulating through their vigilante blackmail. Arthur was killed because he had a change of heart. He decided to turn the ledger over to me, to use it for true exposure, not just profit. Thomas killed Arthur to keep the blackmail operation alive and take sole control of the ledger. He then framed me with the note, knowing I was already the public target. The truth was sickeningly plausible. The dog tag, the silk fragment, Thomas's terrified flight. It wasn't fear of the profiteers that drove him, but fear of being exposed as Arthur's murderer. He was the corrupt mirror image of the noble war hero. "And you want the ledger?" I stated, my voice low. "Yes. Because it contains the names of the real villains, the people responsible for hundreds of deaths. It's the key to bringing down the entire structure of post-war corruption. Thomas is desperate. He knows I'm close. He'll try to sell the ledger, or worse, use it as a shield." "Where is Thomas now?" "I don't know," she confessed, a flicker of true frustration crossing her face. "But I know where he's going. He has an appointment tomorrow morning at the Athenaeum Club, the heart of Melbourne's political elite. He's going to sell the ledger to the highest bidder, likely one of the men on the list." She stood up, pulling a heavy black leather satchel onto the table. It was filled with cash, neatly banded. "I need that ledger, Miss Fisher. It is the final piece of the puzzle. Help me, and you'll get justice for your friend and a clean slate for Thomas's frightened lover, Clarice." She pushed the satchel toward me. "Take this. Use your network, your charm, your considerable talents. The profiteers are meeting at the Athenaeum Club at 10 a.m. to decide who buys the ledger. Stop Thomas. Bring me the book." I looked at the money, then back at her. This was the moral ambiguity of the case, perfectly packaged. I could trust the police, who were chasing shadows and would likely allow the profiteers to slip away, or I could align myself with a killer, a woman who used scarlet ribbons and fear to achieve a righteous end. The choice, however, was no choice at all. Arthur had died fighting corruption. His mission was mine now. "I don't require your money," I said, pushing the satchel back. "I require your name. If I am to trust you, I need to know who I am risking my life for." The woman paused, her tuxedo jacket perfectly straight, her eyes serious. "My name is Eleanor Vance. I was a nurse during the war. My brother was killed by faulty supplies purchased from the men on that list. I am the justice they denied him. Eleanor Vance. The Scarlet Widow. A nurse turned vigilante. It was a compelling, tragic twist. "Very well, Eleanor Vance," I said, standing. "I will retrieve the ledger. But if you have lied, or if you attempt to use this money to escape, I will ensure you meet a justice far harsher than the ribbon you wield." She gave me a slight, respectful bow. "The ledger is all that matters. You have until tomorrow morning. Good luck, Miss Fisher. The Athenaeum is not a place for subtlety." I left the Red Lady's lair, the noise and the glamour receding into the silence of the alley. The cold air hit me, sharpening my focus. I had a target, Thomas Harrington. I had a deadline, 10 a.m. I had a weapon, my wit. And I had the weight of Arthur's mission pressing down on my soul. But as I reached my car, I noticed a small, almost imperceptible detail. The heel of my shoe had snagged on something beneath the factory gate. I reached down, my fingers closing around a strip of leather. It wasn't a piece of my shoe. It was a broken watch strap, a high-quality military-issue leather. I turned it over. Scrawled inside the leather, as if etched with a sharp knife, were two initials. T.H. Thomas Harrington had been here. He hadn't fled the city yet. He had been lurking outside the lair, watching me meet his black tuxedoed nemesis. And if Thomas was close enough to leave his broken watch strap at the gate, he was close enough to hear every word of my conversation with Eleanor Vance. He knew I was coming for him. The game had just become a race, and the Athenaeum Club, a fortress of old money and power, was about to become the deadliest arena in Melbourne. The night, and the tension, stretched impossibly long. Chapter 4. The Athenaeum Arena. The broken watch strap, etched with Thomas Harrington's initials, was a cold, hard nod of assurance. He was panicked, desperate, and, most importantly, he knew my plan. He knew I was coming for the ledger at the Athenaeum Club. This meeting was no longer a discreet investigation. It was a deadly ambush, choreographed by a man living on borrowed time and a stolen face. I spent the remaining hours before dawn mobilizing my resources. I couldn't trust the Melbourne police, not when the target list included several of Jack Robinson's most influential patrons. And I certainly couldn't walk into the Athenaeum, the venerable fortress of old money and male dominance, unprepared. I summoned Mr. Butler, my trusted, albeit perpetually exasperated butler, and gave him the task of arranging a strategic accident near the club's service entrance. I needed a distraction, something loud and disruptive, right at 10 a.m. sharp. I then dispatched my ever-loyal maid to the Public Records Office, demanding every scrap of information on the men listed in Eleanor Vance's, or Thomas's, possession. Knowledge, after all, was the most effective weapon against the establishment. At 9:45 a.m., I arrived at the Athenaeum. I chose a dress that was both a weapon and a shield, a high-necked, dove-grey crepe ensemble, starkly elegant and deliberately conservative, a look that screamed discreet society lady rather than glamorous detective. It allowed me to blend into the background, momentarily concealing the steel beneath the silk. The Athenaeum Club was everything its name suggested. Heavy oak paneling, the air thick with the scent of aged leather and stale power, and an atmosphere of stifling, unquestioned authority. Women were strictly forbidden from the main dining and library areas. I used this ancient rule to my advantage. While the meeting of the war profiteers and Thomas would take place in one of the private upper salons, the sanctums where secrets were shared and fortunes decided, I would enter through the only place women were permitted, the small, ornate ladies' reading room, accessible via a separate side entrance. I passed through the velvet ropes, nodding curtly to the single startled footman. The room was empty, thankfully. I moved to the window, which offered a view of the service alley where Mr. Butler was currently setting up my accident. My plan was precise. Use the chaos of the distraction to slip through the staff corridors, bypass the guards, and infiltrate the private meeting before Thomas could exchange the ledger for his escape money. At 9:59 a.m., I checked my watch, adjusted the placement of my derringer, and took a deep, steadying breath. I could feel the tension vibrating in the very walls of the club, the tension of powerful men about to engage in a dangerous transaction. 10 a.m. The explosion. It wasn't a real explosion, of course. It was merely the loudest backfire a vintage lorry could possibly muster, combined with the spectacular, smoke-billowing collapse of a towering stack of expensive porcelain crates, courtesy of Mr. Butler. The resulting pandemonium was magnificent. Footmen, waiters, and junior clerks, the men who manned the corridors, immediately rushed toward the noise, their faces a mix of panic and excitement. This was my window. I slipped out of the reading room and into the dimly lit servants' passage. The air here was hot, smelling of roasting meat and fear. I moved with the silent, predatory grace I learned on Parisian rooftops, my grey dress barely a whisper against the dark walls. I found the grand staircase leading to the upper salons. 2 heavy security guards, the kind who looked like they enjoyed their work far too much, were still positioned outside the private door, the only ones who hadn't abandoned their post. They were talking in low, anxious whispers, but their attention was clearly pulled toward the chaos below. I needed another distraction. A more personal one. I reached into my sleeve and pulled out a small, highly compressed ammonia capsule, typically used to revive fainting ladies. I didn't throw it. Instead, I crushed it discreetly between my fingers and pressed the wet cotton wool against the end of my stole. I took one agonizing breath, bracing myself against the acrid burn, and then stepped directly into their line of sight. "Gentlemen," I called out, my voice laced with desperate, aristocratic panic. "I think one of the waiters must have dropped something terribly noxious down here. My head. It's quite faint." The guards turned, inhaling the immediate, eye-watering stench of the ammonia. It was a noxious, overwhelming smell, and while not dangerous, it was completely disorienting. They stumbled backward, gagging and waving their hands in the air. "Bloody hell, what is that?" one spluttered, turning away. "The air is poisoned," I shrieked dramatically, adding a convincing tremble to my voice. As they covered their faces, I darted past them. The private salon door was heavy oak, but unlocked. I plunged inside. The air in the salon was clean and controlled. The room was large, dominated by a long, polished table. 5 men sat around it, 3 prominent industrialists on the list, their faces set in expressions of cold anticipation, and at the head of the table, looking pale but utterly composed, was Thomas Harrington. He was dressed in a dark, severe suit, clutching a large, leather-bound book, the ledger, in his hands. His eyes, Arthur's eyes, were the first to snap to mine. The shock was immediately replaced by a desperate, trapped fury. "Miss Fisher," Thomas shouted, leaping to his feet, knocking his heavy chair backward. "How did you?" "I have a certain talent for showing up uninvited, Mr. Harrington," I said, striding into the room, my voice cool despite the racing of my pulse. I had maybe 30 seconds before the guards recovered. "And it is Mr. Thomas Harrington, isn't it? The one who was supposed to be dead." The 3 industrialists, Mr. Davies, the munitions manufacturer, General Hawthorne, the disgraced commander, and Lord Ashworth, the shipping magnate, looked utterly bewildered, their conspiracy suddenly disrupted by a lady in a grey dress. Who the devil is this woman? Lord Ashworth roared, his face turning an alarming shade of puce. She's trouble, Thomas snarled, his eyes darting frantically toward the ledger. She's working with the widow. Kill her. Thomas swung the heavy ledger at me, but I was faster. I ducked, feeling the wind of the book pass over my head. The ledger, hitting the air, released a shower of fine powdery dust that settled over the table. Davies, the munitions man, reached for a discreet buzzer under the table. General Hawthorne grabbed a heavy silver letter opener. The room had instantly devolved from a secret meeting to a savage brawl. I drew my derringer. The click of the safety being released was a sound that commanded attention. "Stop," I ordered, the word echoing with finality. "The first man to move will be the first man to meet my excellent aim. You gentlemen are all guilty of profiteering, betrayal, and murder. But only one of you is the immediate killer." Thomas backed away, holding the ledger like a shield. Arthur was going to ruin everything. He was soft. I had to stop him from exposing us all, from losing the fortune. Arthur was killed because he chose justice over fortune, I corrected, my voice hard. You chose the opposite, Thomas. You used his identity, stole his life, and now you've murdered him to protect your ill-gotten gains. Where is the money, Thomas? The payoff for the ledger? Thomas, cornered, lifted the ledger high. It's gone. But I have this. This is worth more than all of you combined. In one sudden, desperate move, he lifted the book and threw it into the lit marble fireplace. A collective gasp went around the room. The ledger, the proof, the key, the only hope for justice, was engulfed in flames. Before anyone could react, the outer door burst open. Not the guards, but Jack Robinson, his face furious, his eyes searching. He must have followed my car, or been alerted by the commotion. Phryne. What in God's name is going on here? The sight of the burning ledger, the armed woman, and the terrified tycoons was too much for the inspector. He drew his own service revolver, pointing it directly at me. Drop the weapon, Miss Fisher. You're under arrest for trespassing and arson. My gaze flickered from the burning ledger to Jack's resolute, confused face, and then to Thomas, who was using the distraction to scramble over the table, aiming for the window. He was going to escape. I had to choose, justice for Arthur, or my own freedom. In a split second of icy clarity, I made my decision. I fired my derringer. The shot was not aimed at Thomas. It was aimed at the heavy crystal water carafe sitting on the sideboard. The glass shattered with a deafening explosion, sending shards flying everywhere. The noise, amplified in the small room, deafened Jack for a crucial moment. Thomas, startled by the shot, tripped over the table, falling hard. The three industrialists screamed and ducked for cover. I used the chaos. I grabbed the heavy, burning ledger from the fireplace, shielding my hands with the satin lining of my fur stole, and dove for the small, concealed exit door Thomas had been aiming for. Phryne. Stop. I heard Jack's voice roaring, regaining his senses. I yanked the door open and vanished down a narrow, darkened service stairway. I was clutching the burning ledger, the proof of corruption, the key to the Scarlet Widow's vendetta. But the heavy smoke from the ledger was choking me, and the satin of my stole was quickly catching fire. I stumbled down the stairs, the fire racing up my arm, the wood groaning beneath my weight. I could hear Jack's heavy boots thundering after me, and the frantic shouts of the guards finally arriving. I reached the bottom of the stairs, plunging into a pitch-black coal cellar. The ledger, now fully engulfed, illuminated the terrifying space for a split second. And then, a hand, strong and unexpected, clamped over my mouth and dragged me violently back into the deeper shadows. Be quiet, Phryne, a voice hissed into my ear. A familiar voice, deep and controlled, laced with the scent of pine and gunpowder. It wasn't Thomas. It wasn't Jack. It was Eleanor Vance, the Scarlet Widow, standing right behind me, dressed in a black, oil-stained boiler suit, her face grim with anticipation. She had been waiting for me. "Give me the ledger," she commanded, her voice urgent. "Before he gets here. Before who gets here?" I choked, fighting her grip, the burning book clutched tightly in my other hand. As if on cue, the trapdoor above us burst open, flooding the cellar with light. Standing over us, his face a mask of rage and triumph, was a man I hadn't seen at the meeting. He was holding a pistol, and his eyes were cold, calculating, and utterly focused on the prize in my hand. He wasn't on the list. He wasn't one of the profiteers. He was a new face. "Drop the book, Phryne," he snarled, aiming the gun. "Or I'll kill you both right here." The cellar door was sealed behind him. Eleanor's grip was firm. The man had a gun. And the ledger was rapidly burning to ashes in my hand. The truth, it seemed, was still 2 steps ahead of me. Chapter 5. The Architect of Treachery. The heat from the burning ledger was intense, a searing promise of lost evidence. I stood trapped in the coal cellar, the acrid smoke stinging my eyes, caught between Eleanor Vance, the Scarlet Widow, and the newly arrived man with the gun. The moment was suspended in a horrifying tableau of betrayal and fire. "Drop it now," the man ordered again, his voice cracking with desperation. I didn't need to ask Eleanor who he was. His face, lean and hard, was a roadmap of ambition, his eyes holding the cold, calculating hunger of a true criminal. He was the architect of the scheme, the one who didn't just want a piece of the corruption but the entire edifice. "Thomas's partner," Eleanor hissed in my ear, her voice tight with fury, her grip on my shoulder unyielding. "Arthur told me about him. He runs the money for the profiteers. He's been using Thomas as a tool." I glanced down at the burning ledger. The black leather was curled and smoking, the paper inside turning brittle and brown. I had only seconds. "You're too late," I gasped, shoving the burning book into the face of the man who held the gun. He roared in pain and surprise, stumbling backward as the burning leather met his skin. I used the split-second distraction to execute a perfect, swift movement. I elbowed Eleanor hard in the ribs, breaking her grip, and dove to the side, rolling under a mound of dusty coal sacks. The sound of the pistol shot was deafening in the enclosed space. The bullet smacked harmlessly into the thick brick wall where my head had been moments before. "The book!" the man screamed, scrambling to recover from the burn. His gun now trained on the smoky ledger lying on the cellar floor. Eleanor, recovering instantly, launched herself at him, a silent, deadly projectile in her oil-stained suit. They crashed into a pile of coal, the gun clattering away into the dark. I crawled quickly toward the ledger, my hand wrapped around the remaining spine, pulling it free from the spreading flames. Most of the pages were charred black, but a small central section was still untouched, protected by the thick leather. I heard the frantic scrambling above me as Jack Robinson and the Athenaeum guards finally found the cellar's trapdoor. Time had run out. "Phryne, is that you? Are you all right?" Jack's voice was sharp with worry. I didn't answer. I had to secure this last piece of evidence. Eleanor and the architect of treachery were locked in a silent, savage grapple, covered in coal dust and fury. I knew they would both fight to the death to keep the truth from escaping the cellar. I had the book. Now I needed an exit. My eyes swept the perimeter. Above the ground level, there was a small, dusty window, barely large enough for a person. It was my only way out. "Jack!" I yelled up to the light, forcing my voice to project over the struggle below. "It's a trap. The killer is here. Get down here now." The distraction worked. I heard the trapdoor creak wider as Jack, fueled by protective instinct and duty, prepared to descend. I didn't wait. I scrambled over a towering pile of coal, kicking a shower of black dust into the faces of the two fighters as I passed them. I reached the window, ignoring the searing pain in my hands from the heat of the book. I kicked out the pane of glass with the heel of my shoe and squeezed through the small aperture, landing hard on the muddy ground of the service alley outside. The sound of shouting and more gunshots echoed from the cellar below. I didn't stop to look back. I had the ledger, or what was left of it, and I was now the most wanted woman in Melbourne, by the police, by Eleanor Vance, and by the profiteer's enforcer. I didn't go home. I took a cab to a discreet safe house I kept on the outskirts of Fitzroy, a dilapidated terrace house where no one would think to look for Miss Phryne Fisher. The first thing I did was examine the ledger. I spread the charred artifact on a clean table. With meticulous care, I peeled back the burned layers. There were approximately 20 pages surviving in the middle, brittle but readable. They contained names, dates, and amounts, the cold hard proof of the war profiteering ring. The entries confirmed what Eleanor had claimed: Davies, Hawthorne, Ashworth. Their betrayal was laid bare in ink. But the ledger also contained 3 other names, men who seemed to be funding and coordinating the ring from afar. The entries were annealed, not by Thomas, but by the architect, the man who was now either arrested or fighting his way out of the cellar. The ledger was damning, but it was the unburned pages that contained the true, final twist. On the very last intact sheet, sandwiched between the names of the profiteers and the final transaction date, was a hastily scrawled note, hidden from the fire. T is compromised. The widow is not E. Vance. The real Scarlet Widow, A. M. is running the operation from the inside. Meet at the Opera House Box 7 tonight. My breath hitched. The carefully constructed truth, handed to me by Eleanor Vance, was an elegant, masterful double bluff. She wasn't the Scarlet Widow. She was simply a dedicated vigilante who had allowed me to believe she was the killer to secure my help and the ledger. The real killer, the mastermind, was someone else entirely, A.M., and she was deeply entrenched within the high society I moved in. The implication was chilling. Eleanor Vance was chasing the wrong person, Thomas, and I had been expertly manipulated. The entire affair, from the knot to the note, had been a smokescreen for a different, more sophisticated player. The Opera House, the heart of Melbourne's high culture and grand events, the very antithesis of the dark, smoky cabaret. And Box 7, the secluded opulent seats reserved for the city's most powerful elite. The real Scarlet Widow was not a ghost in a tuxedo but a glamorous woman of position, watching the city's power players from the privacy of her box, moving among them, invisible in plain sight. I felt a surge of exhilaration mixed with a terrifying awareness of the danger. Arthur's final message, the one that got him killed, was not about Thomas or Eleanor. It was about A.M., the true killer who had been lurking in the shadows all along. I had been chasing the wrong ghost. I looked at the initials. A.M. Could it be a society matron? A prominent performer? A politician's wife? The name held endless, terrifying possibilities. I had to get to the Opera House. I had to face the true Scarlet Widow, the one who tied the precise Turk's head knot and managed to fool even me. I picked up the phone to call and give her the new coordinates, but before I could dial, the front door of the safe house crashed inward with a deafening sound of splintering wood. 2 men, heavy-set and brutal, their faces grim, stormed into the hallway. They weren't police, they were muscle, the kind hired by those who preferred silence to legality. "Miss Fisher," one roared, spotting me in the parlor, the charred ledger lying on the table like a prize. "We're here for the book. Mr. Thomas Harrington sends his regards." Thomas. He wasn't captured. He was still running, and he wanted the last scrap of proof. I was trapped. I snatched the remaining pages of the ledger, thrusting them down the front of my dress. There was no time to reach the derringer. I turned and vaulted over the table, aiming for the back exit. The men lunged, their hands reaching, their faces contorted with rage. I was fast, but they were relentless. The opera house was hours away, and I was about to be silenced in the heart of Fitzroy. The tension was suffocating, the danger real and immediate. I had to escape, or the mystery, and the justice Arthur died for, would be buried with me. Chapter 6. The Curtain Call. The world dissolved into a flurry of motion and adrenaline. Thomas Harrington's thugs were inside, and the only path to the opera house was through them. I didn't stop to fight. The ledger pages were tucked securely against my chest, my most crucial asset. I kicked out the window of the back door, a desperate, shattering noise that signaled my escape attempt. I slipped out into the overgrown, weedy backyard, the two brutes lunging after me with guttural shouts. They were faster than I anticipated. I cleared the low fence, scrambling into the next yard, but the second thug caught my ankle. I went down hard in the dirt, the wind knocked out of me. He was heavy, his breath hot and rancid in my ear as he wrestled for the pages under my dress. "Let go, you swine," I snarled, driving my elbow hard into his jaw. He loosened his grip just enough. I seized the opportunity, pulling the pearl-handled derringer from its holster and delivering a sharp, precise rap to his temple. He slumped, unconscious, into the flower bed. The first thug was now upon me. He was smarter, moving in a practiced boxing stance. I couldn't rely on brute force. I had to use the environment. I spun away, leading him toward the rickety, old wood shed. He followed, his eyes fixed on the outline of the pages against my gown. Just as he reached me, I grabbed a heavy rusted garden rake leaning against the shed and swung it low, hooking the tines around his ankle. He bellowed, crashing to the ground in a cloud of dust and debris. I didn't wait to see if he rose. I scaled the back wall and dropped onto the pavement of a quiet side street, gasping for air. I flagged down a taxi, tearing off my torn and dirty dress coat. The opera house. And if we break the speed limit, I'll pay double. The Melbourne Opera House was a fortress of culture and privilege, its facade glowing under the evening lights. The scent of fear was replaced by the heady perfume of high society. It was 8:30 p.m. The main performance, Verdi's Aida, was well underway, a dramatic backdrop to my own perilous drama. I strode through the magnificent foyer, my gown now smudged with dirt and soot, my hair slightly mussed, but my chin high. A startled usher tried to bar my path. "I am Miss Fisher," I stated, my voice cutting through the elegant murmurs. "And I have an urgent matter with a guest in box 7. My name worked its magic. I was escorted up the grand staircase, my mind racing. A.M. The true Scarlet Widow. Not Eleanor Vance, but a highly placed individual who used the chaos and confusion to eliminate threats to the profiteering ring. I reached the private box level. The usher discreetly pointed out box 7 and left, sensing the tension radiating from me. I smoothed the skirt of my gown, adjusted the concealed derringer, and pushed open the heavy velvet door. The box was dim, hushed, overlooking the vast, silent spectacle of the stage. The music swelled, a chorus of tragedy and betrayal, perfectly fitting. Only one person was seated inside. A woman. She was petite, perfectly groomed, and draped in a stunning gown of sapphire velvet. Her chestnut hair was intricately coiffed, and she wore a spectacular diamond necklace that caught the stage light. She was the image of untouchable high society. She turned her head slowly, a delicate, almost regretful smile on her face. "Miss Fisher, you're late. I almost thought Thomas had managed to intercept you." I recognized her instantly from the society pages. She was Lady Adelaide Montrose, the wife of Sir Hugh Montrose, the newly appointed Minister of Trade, one of the most powerful men in the entire Commonwealth. A.M. "Lady Montrose," I said, stepping fully into the box and letting the door click shut behind me. I confess, I didn't expect the Scarlet Widow to be dressed in such refined taste. or to be the wife of a man who stands to gain so much from the corruption. She chuckled, a dry, elegant sound. You expected a cabaret dancer or a soldier, didn't you? The irony is delicious. Everyone searches the shadows for the killer. They never look at the person already seated at the head table. I watched the stage, the distant figures playing out their roles. Arthur's note led me here. The real one, hidden in the ledger. He knew you were using Thomas and Eleanor's vendetta as a distraction. You tied the Turk's head knot. It was a naval knot, wasn't it? Your husband, the Minister of Trade, a man who built his fortune on shipping during the war. Adelaide sighed, picking up a pair of elaborate opera glasses. Arthur was a sentimental fool. He finally realized that my husband was the real financier behind the profiteering ring. Sir Hugh owns the shipping lines, the banks, and the political power. The profiteers, Davies, Hawthorne, they were merely foot soldiers. And Arthur, I pressed, my voice low, discovered you were coordinating the assassinations. You were eliminating the loose ends, the men who knew too much, using the widow persona to create public hysteria and frame an easy target. Precisely, she admitted, turning the glasses over in her hands. Arthur was going to expose Sir Hugh. That, Miss Fisher, is treason to my entire world. I killed Arthur, yes. I tied that silly silk ribbon, stolen from a bolt intended for my husband's private cabin curtains. A single, decisive cut. And Thomas? He was easy to manipulate. Give a greedy man a righteous cause and a dead man's face, and he'll do anything you want. The sophistication of the conspiracy was staggering. The real killer was a master manipulator, pulling strings from the very height of Melbourne society. And now you want the ledger, I said, reaching for the strap of my clutch. The pages, yes, Adelaide agreed, her eyes finally turning cold. You are the last loose end, Miss Fisher. And I cannot risk my husband's ascendancy on the whim of a glamorous detective. I'm afraid your curtain call must come early. She didn't reach for a gun. Instead, she lifted the opera glasses and, with a subtle shift of her wrist, aimed them toward the ceiling. The glasses were not simply for viewing the stage. They were a sophisticated signaling device. Suddenly, the side door to the box flew open. It was not a thug. It was a man in the uniform of an opera house security guard, but his eyes were hard and his movements efficient. He stepped inside, blocking my only exit. Retrieve the pages, Adelaide ordered, her voice completely devoid of emotion. And make her disappearance look like a simple, accidental fall during the chaos of the intermission. I had no choice. I drew my derringer, but before I could fire, the guard moved with impossible speed, knocking the tiny weapon from my hand. It clattered harmlessly onto the thick carpet. He was highly trained, probably ex-military, retained by the Minister of Trade for special duties. He lunged, his goal not to kill, but to incapacitate. I twisted, avoiding his grasp, but the confined space of the box was against me. I smashed my fist down onto the ledge of the box, knocking the expensive glasses from Adelaide's grasp. They shattered on the floor, momentarily distracting the guard. I used the moment. I didn't try to escape through the door. I didn't try to fight the guard. Instead, I grabbed the lapel of the guard's jacket and pulled him toward the balustrade of the box. The security guard, surprised, tried to resist, but I had the advantage of surprise and sheer desperation. I launched us both over the velvet railing, plunging us into the darkness. A collective horrified gasp rose from the crowd in the stalls below. We didn't fall to the floor. We landed on the heavy protective safety net stretched beneath the box level, a precaution installed after a tragedy years ago. The guard was stunned by the jarring impact. I scrambled free, tearing the pages of the ledger from my gown as I did. The entire opera house was in pandemonium. The music stopped. The stage lights flashed on, illuminating the scene, A man and a woman tangled in the netting high above the stalls. Miss Fisher. I heard Jack Robinson's desperate voice from below. He must have followed me from the Athenaeum. I saw Adelaide Montrose standing above me in box 7, her face a mask of cold fury and panic. She knew her game was over. I reached into the inner pocket of the security guard's jacket. I pulled out his wallet, ripping out a small, folded piece of paper, a note written in Adelaide's elegant hand, instructing him to dispose of my body in the bay. I held the note and the ledger pages high above my head, a desperate, undeniable symbol of proof. "Here is your killer, Inspector," I screamed, my voice echoing over the silent, terrified crowd. Lady Montrose. The true Scarlet Widow. The architect of treachery. The weight of the crowd's sudden shift, from terror to comprehension, was palpable. Adelaide Montrose, trapped in the light, her carefully constructed world collapsing, stared down at me. She knew she couldn't escape the net, the note, or the pages. She retreated into the shadows of the box, the heavy velvet curtains swishing shut. Jack and his constables rushed the main entrance to box 7. I watched as they dragged the battered security guard from the safety net. The game had ended, not with a fatal shot, but with an irrefutable revelation, played out on the grandest stage in Melbourne. I had justice for Arthur. I had the true widow. And the mystery, for Miss Phryne Fisher, was finally solved. Epilogue. The unspoken justice. The arrest of Lady Adelaide Montrose shattered the porcelain facade of Melbourne's high society. Sir Hugh Montrose's empire quickly crumbled, the charred pages of the ledger now the most expensive evidence in the Commonwealth speaking volumes that politics could not silence. Eleanor Vance, the other A, disappeared into the night, her brand of vigilante justice accomplished, though perhaps without the public spectacle she had planned. And Thomas Harrington, the desperate double, was eventually tracked down, his greed leading him not to fortune, but to a bleak jail cell. As for Detective Inspector Jack Robinson, he arrived at my residence the next morning, not with handcuffs, but with a weary sigh and a bottle of my favorite French brandy. We sat, the city's dawn washing over the chaos of the night before. "You know, Phryne," he said, his voice heavy, "you could have simply brought the evidence to me. You nearly got yourself killed twice, exposed half the city's cabinet, and you're now facing charges for assault, destruction of property, and reckless endangerment." I merely smiled, pouring myself a liberal measure of the brandy. "Jack, where's the fun in a simple warrant? Justice, like a good melody, requires a bit of dramatic flair. Arthur died because he sought to expose the rot that festered beneath the surface of the respectable world. Adelaide Montrose was just a more dangerous, stylish version of the truth." I lifted my glass. "To Arthur. And to the unspoken justice, the kind that sometimes needs a silk ribbon and a pearl-handled derringer to see the light." The Scarlet Widow of St. Kilda was solved, but the truth, like a haunting waltz, lingered. Behind every rose, there is a mystery. Behind every layer of sophistication, there is a secret waiting to be uncovered. And Phryne Fisher, glamorous, independent, and always fearless, was already looking toward the horizon, anticipating the next challenge. If you were captivated by the glamour, danger, and intricate betrayals of 1920s Melbourne, then you found your home here at Mysteries and Roses. This story of Phryne Fisher and the Scarlet Widow perfectly captures the blend of elegance and intrigue that defines our channel. We dive deep into the world's most luxurious, yet deadly mysteries. Was Adelaide Montrose truly the most terrifying villain? Did Eleanor Vance deserve to walk free? We want to know your thoughts on the final twist. Join the investigation now. Subscribe to Mysteries and Roses. Don't miss the next case. Click that subscribe button and the notification bell so you're always ready for our next deep dive into history's most glamorous crimes. Leave a comment. Tell us which part of the story gave you the biggest chill. Thank you for reading, and remember, in the world of Mysteries and Roses, the truth is always the most beautiful and the most dangerous thing.